She opened the door to my room, a vault that by February was being disturbed more and more, though no one, not my mother or father, nor Buckley or Lindsay, confessed to entering, nor to taking things that they didn't plan on returning. They were blind to the clues that each of them came visited me there. Any disturbance, even if it could not possibly be blamed on Holiday, was blamed on him. Lindsay wanted to look nice for Samuel. She opened the double doors to my closet and reviewed the mess. I hadn't been exactly orderly, so every time my mother told us to clean up, I'd shoved whatever was on the floor or bed into my closet. Lindsay had always wanted the clothes I owned first run, but had gotten them all as hand-me-downs. "Gosh," she said, whispering into the darkness of my closet. She realized with guilt and glee that everything she saw before her was hers now. "Hello? Knock, knock," said Grandma Lynn. Lindsay jumped. "Sorry to disturb you, hun," she said. "I thought I heard you in here." My grandmother stood in what my mother called one of her Jackie Kennedy dresses. She had never understood why, unlike the rest of us, her mother had no hips. She could slide into a straight-cut dress and fill it out just enough, even at 62, to look perfect in it. "What are you doing here?" Lindsay asked. "I need help with the zipper." Grandma Lynn turned, and Lindsay could see what she had never seen on our own mother. The back of Grandma Lynn's black bra, the top of her half-slip. She walked the step or two over to our grandmother and, trying not to touch anything but the zipper tab, zipped her up. "How about that hook and eye up there?" said Grandma Lynn. "Can you get that?" There were powdery smells and Chanel No. 5 sprinkled all around our grandmother's neck. "It's one of the reasons for a man. You can't do this stuff yourself." Lindsay was as tall as our grandmother and still growing. As she took the hook and eye in either hand, she saw the fine wisps of dyed blonde hair at the base of my grandmother's skull. She saw the downy grey hair trailing along her back and neck. She hooked the dress and then stood there. "I've forgotten what she looked like," Lindsay said. "What?" Grandma Lynn turned. "I can't remember," Lindsay said. "I mean her neck, you know. Did I ever look at it?" "Oh, honey," Grandma Lynn said. "Come here." She opened up her arms, but Lindsay turned into the closet. "I need to look pretty," she said. "You are pretty," Grandma Lynn said. Lindsay couldn't get her breath. One thing Grandma Lynn never did was dole out compliments. When they came, they were unexpected gold. "We'll find you a nice outfit in here," Grandma Lynn said, and strode towards my clothes. No one could shop a rack like Grandma Lynn. On the rare occasions that she visited near the start of the school year, she would take the two of us out. We marvelled at her as we watched her nimble fingers play the hangers like so many keys. Suddenly, hesitating only for a moment, she would pull out a dress or shirt and hold it up to us. "What do you think?" she'd ask. It was always perfect. As she considered my separates, plucked and posed them against my sister's torso, she talked. "Your mother's a wreck, Lindsay. I've never seen her like this before." "Grandma, hush, I'm thinking." She held up my favourite church dress. It was a black watch wool with a Peter Pan collar. I liked it mostly because the skirt was so big I could sit in the pew cross-legged and flounce the hem down to the ground. "Where did she get this sack?" my grandmother asked. "Your dad. He's a mess too, but he's mad about it." "Who is that man you asked Mum about?" She stiffened on the question. "What man?" "You asked Mum if Dad still was saying that man did it." "What man?" "Voila!" Grandma Lynn held up a dark blue mini dress that my sister had never seen. It was Clarissa's. "It's so short," Lindsay said. "I'm shocked at your mother," Grandma Lynn said. "She let the kid get something stylish." My father called up from the hallway that he expected everyone downstairs in 10 minutes. Grandma Lynn went into preparation overdrive. She helped Lindsay get the dark blue dress over her head, and then they ran back to Lindsay's room for shoes. And then, finally, in the hallway, under the overhead light, she fixed the smudged eyeliner and mascara on my sister's face. She finished her off with firmly pressed powder, whisking the cotton pad lightly in an upward direction along either side of Lindsay's face. It wasn't until my grandmother came downstairs, and my mother commented on the shortness of Lindsay's dress while looking suspiciously at Grandma Lynn, that my sister and I realised Grandma Lynn didn't have a spot of makeup on her own face. Buckley rode between them in the back seat, and as they neared the church, he looked at Grandma Lynn and asked what she was doing. "When you don't have time for rouge, this puts a little life into them," she said, and so Buckley copied her and pinched his cheeks. Samuel Heckler was standing by the stone post that marked the path to the church door. He was dressed all in black, and beside him his older brother, Hal, stood wearing the beat-up leather jacket Samuel had worn on Christmas Day. His brother was like a dark print of Samuel. He was tanned, and his face was weathered from riding his motorcycle full tilt down country roads. As my family approached, Hal turned quickly and walked away. "This must be Samuel," my grandmother said. "I'm the evil Grandma." "Shall we go in?" my father said. "It's nice to see you, Samuel." Lindsay and Samuel led the way, while my grandmother dropped back and walked to the other side of my mother, a united front. Detective Fenneman was standing by the doorway in an itchy-looking suit. He nodded at my parents and seemed to linger on my mother. "Will you join us?" my father asked. "Thank you," he said, "but I just want to be in the vicinity." "We appreciate that." They walked into the cramped vestibule of our church. I wanted to snake up my father's back, circle his neck, whisper in his ear, but I was already there in his every pore and crevice. He had woken up with a hangover and turned over on his side to watch my mother's shallow breathing against the pillow. His lovely wife, his lovely girl. He wanted to place his hand on her cheek, smooth her hair back from her face, kiss her, but sleeping, she was at peace. He hadn't woken a day since my death when the day wasn't something to get through. But the truth was, the memorial service day was not the worst kind. At least it was honest. At least it was a day shaped around what they were so preoccupied by, my absence. Today he would not have to pretend he was getting back to normal, whatever normal was. Today he could walk tall with grief, and so could Abigail. But he knew that as soon as she woke up, he would not really look at her for the rest of the day, not really look into her and see the woman he had known her to be before the day they had taken in the news of my death. At nearly 2 months, the idea of it as news was fading away in the hearts of all but my family. And Ruth. She came with my father. They were standing in the corner with her father. They were standing in the corner near the glass case that held a chalice used during the Revolutionary War, when the church had been a hospital. Mr. and Mrs. Jewett were making small talk with them. At home on her desk, Mrs. Jewett had a poem of Ruth's. On Monday she was going to the guidance counsellor with it. It was a poem about me. "My wife seems to agree with Principal Caden," Ruth's father was saying, that the memorial will help allow the kids to accept it. "What do you think?" Mr. Jewett asked. "I think let bygones be bygones and leave the family to their own, but Ruthie wanted to come." Ruth watched my family greet people and noted in horror of my sister's new look. Ruth did not believe in makeup. She thought it demeaned women. Samuel Heckler was holding Lindsay's hand. A word from her readings popped up into her head. Subjugation. But then I saw her notice Hal Heckler through the window. He was standing out by the oldest graves in the front and pulling out a cigarette butt. "Ruthie," her father asked, "what is it?" She focused again and looked at him. "What's what?" "You were staring off into space just now," he said. "I like the way the graveyard looks." "Ah, kid, you're my angel," he said. "Let's grab a seat before the good ones get taken." Clarissa was there, with the sheepish-looking Brian Nelson, who was wearing a suit of his father's. She made her way to my family, and when Principal Caden and Mr. Bott saw her, they fell away and let her approach. She shook hands with my father first. "Hello, Clarissa," he said. "How are you?" "Okay," she said. "How are you and Mrs. Salmon?" "We're fine, Clarissa," he said. What an odd lie, I thought. Would you like to join us in the family pew? She looked down at her hands. I'm with my boyfriend. My mother had entered some trance-like state and was staring hard at Clarissa's face. Clarissa was alive and I was dead. Clarissa began to feel it, the eyes boring into her, and she wanted to get away. Then Clarissa saw the dress. Hey, she said, reaching out toward my sister. What is it, Clarissa? My mother snapped. Nothing, she said. She looked at the dress again, and knew she could never ask for it back now. Abigail? My father said. He was attuned to her voice, her anger. Something was off. Grandma Lynn, who stood just a bit behind my mother, winked at Clarissa. I was just noticing how good Lindsay looked, Clarissa said. My sister blushed. The people in the vestibule began to stir and part. It was the Reverend Strick, walking in his vestments toward my parents. Clarissa faded back to look for Brian Nelson. When she found him, she joined him out among the graves. Ray Singh stayed away. He said goodbye to me in his own way, by looking at a picture, my studio portrait, that I had given him that fall. He looked into the eyes of that photograph and saw right through them to the backdrop of marbleized suede every kid had to sit in front of under a hot light. What did Deb mean? Ray wondered. It meant lost. It meant frozen. It meant gone. He knew that no one ever really looked the way they did in photos. He knew he didn't look as wild or as frightened as he did in his own. He came to realize something as he stared at my photo, that it was not me. I was in the air around him. I was in the cold mornings he had now with Ruth. I was in the quiet time he spent alone between studying. I was the girl he had chosen to kiss. He wanted, somehow, to set me free. He didn't want to burn my photo or toss it away, but he didn't want to look at me anymore, either. I watched him as he placed the photograph in one of the giant volumes of Indian poetry in which he and his mother had pressed dozens of fragile flowers that were slowly turning to dust. At the service they said nice things about me. Reverend Strick, Principal Caden, Mrs. Jewett. But my father and mother sat through it numbed. Samuel kept squeezing Lindsay's hand, but she didn't seem to notice him. She barely blinked. Buckley sat in a small suit borrowed for the occasion from Nate, who had attended a wedding that year. He fidgeted and watched my father. It was Grandma Lynn who did the most important thing that day. During the final hymn, as my family stood, she leaned over to Lindsay and whispered, "By the door, that's him." Lindsay looked over. Standing just behind Len Fenneman, who was now inside the doorway and singing along, stood a man from the neighbourhood. He was dressed more casually than anyone else, wearing flannel-lined khaki trousers and a heavy flannel shirt. For a moment Lindsay thought she recognised him. Their eyes locked. Then she passed out. In all the commotion of attending to her, George Harvey slipped between the Revolutionary War gravestones behind the church and walked away without being noticed.